The census record stopped me cold. I was digging through Pennsylvania archives looking at industrial labour records from the 1890s, cross-referencing employment ledgers with immigration documents, the usual academic drudgery. And then I'd found it. A handwritten note in the margin of a Bethlehem Ironworks payroll sheet from October 1895. It read, "Speak American or find other work, no exceptions." Below that, a foreman had written 3 names, all crossed out in red ink. Next to the names, a single word in block letters, "Died as charged." The handwriting was dated November 2nd, 1895. The old ink was faded, but the message was clear. 3 lives ended with a pen stroke. That margin note led me into one of the most deliberately erased chapters in American economic history. Between 1870 and 1920, an estimated 23 million immigrants arrived in the United States. They spoke Polish, Italian, Yiddish, Hungarian, Slovak, Ukrainian, and dozens of other languages. And in the factories, mines and mills where they worked, a coordinated system was implemented to make those languages disappear. Not through law, through wages. The last families who resisted were not defying the government, they were defying their paychecks. And by 1895 the system had them cornered. The 3 names on that payroll sheet were Jan Kovac, Mihaly Toth, and Stefan Wojcik. All were employed at Bethlehem Iron, one of the largest steel producers in America. All 3 had worked there for more than 8 years. All 3 were fired on the same day for speaking their native languages during a lunch break. And here is what the discharge papers do not mention. Jan Kovac's son, age 11, was the only Slovak speaker in his public school class. Mihaly Toth's wife spoke no English. Stefan Wojcik's father, 64, lived with the family and had never learned more than 20 words of English in 40 years in America. When the men were fired, the entire extended family lost the ability to communicate across generations in their own home. Now, I know the obvious response. This was assimilation. This was progress. Immigrants needed to learn English to succeed in America, and the factories were simply enforcing a practical standard for workplace safety and efficiency. The objection is not unreasonable, and if that is where the story ended, I would not be telling it. But that is not where it ended, because the same companies firing workers for speaking their native languages were the same companies running the immigrant recruitment pipelines that brought those workers to America in the first place. Bethlehem Iron had agents in 14 European countries. They published recruitment materials in Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and Italian. They promised housing, steady wages, and community support. And the moment those workers arrived and started producing steel, the language that got them hired became the language that could get them fired. This is where the story turns strange, because in 1895, the same year those 3 men were discharged, something else was happening in Pennsylvania. The state legislature passed an amendment to the public school code requiring all instruction to be conducted in English. The law specifically targeted German language schools, which had operated in Pennsylvania for more than 150 years. But the enforcement was not uniform. In rural areas where German communities had political power, the law was ignored. In industrial towns where immigrant labor was concentrated, it was enforced immediately. The Pennsylvania Department of Public Instruction hired inspectors whose sole job was to visit schools in coal and steel towns and ensure that no foreign languages were being taught. If a school was found in violation, state funding was revoked. Within 2 years, more than 400 German language schools had closed. Here is what makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The timeline is too precise. In 1894, the Bethlehem Ironworks expanded its open hearth steel production and needed 1,200 additional workers. Recruitment agents were dispatched to Eastern Europe. By early 1895, the new workers had arrived, been trained, and were producing steel. In August 1895, the Pennsylvania school law passed. In October 1895, Bethlehem Iron issued its English-only workplace policy. In November 1895, the first wave of discharges began. The workers had been in America for less than 18 months. Their children had been in American schools for less than a year, and the system that recruited them was now structured to ensure they could not pass their language to the next generation. But the Pennsylvania story is only one piece. Pull the lens back further. In 1887, the federal government passed the American Protective Association's English-only petition, which called for all public business to be conducted in English. It did not pass into law, but it set the rhetorical framework. Between 1889 and 1921, 34 states passed laws restricting or banning foreign language instruction in public and private schools. The justifications varied. Some cited patriotism, others cited public health, claiming that speaking multiple languages caused mental confusion in children. One 1918 Iowa proclamation banned all oral foreign language communication in public spaces, including telephone conversations. Between 1870 and 1910, U.S. industrial output increased by more than 600%. Steel production went from 77,000 tons in 1870 to 26 million tons in 1910. Coal mining expanded from 33 million tons to 455 million tons. That expansion required labour, millions of workers, and those workers came from countries where labour movements, socialist organising and union activity were far more developed than in the United States. The languages those workers spoke were not just a cultural heritage, they were the language of organising. The industrial workers of the world understood this. Between 1905 and 1917, the IWW published organising materials in 27 languages. They printed strike pamphlets in Italian for textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in Slovak for coal miners in Pennsylvania, in Finnish for copper miners in Montana. And in every major industrial city, the response from ownership was the same: English-only workplace policies, English-only union meetings, English-only grievance procedures. If you could not articulate your complaint in English, your complaint did not exist. And if your complaint did not exist, you could be replaced. The factories had a waiting list of workers who would take your job for less money and fewer questions asked. The case that makes this undeniable happened in 1897 in Latimer, Pennsylvania. On September 10th, a group of striking coal miners, mostly Polish, Slovak and Lithuanian immigrants, marched from the town of Hazleton toward the Latimer mines to demand higher wages and safer conditions. They carried American flags. They sang hymns in their native languages. As they approached the Latimer junction, a sheriff and 150 armed deputies blocked the road. According to witness testimony, the sheriff ordered the marchers to disperse. The miners did not understand the order. The sheriff spoke English. The miners spoke Polish and Slovak. Interpreters were not present. The sheriff gave the order to fire. Within 90 seconds, 19 miners were dead and 38 were wounded, many shot in the back as they fled. At the trial, the deputies were acquitted. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. In the same Pennsylvania towns where immigrant workers were being told to speak American or find other work. In the same years that state legislatures were closing foreign language schools, in the same decades that deputies were shooting miners who did not understand English commands, something else was happening. The corporate towns were being built. By 1910, an estimated 3% of the US population lived in company-owned housing. These were not just dormitories. They were entire municipalities owned and operated by the mines, mills and factories. The company owned the houses, the stores, the schools and the churches. Rent was deducted directly from wages, and in these towns the rules were explicit. Bethlehem Steel's housing regulations from 1908 prohibited the speaking of foreign languages in company housing common areas. Violations resulted in eviction. A family could be removed from company housing, lose their job, and be blacklisted from employment in the entire region for speaking their native language on their own front porch. The system was not just economic, it was total. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I. Within weeks, German-language newspapers were shut down across the country. German-language church services were banned. Towns with German names were renamed. The governor of Iowa banned the speaking of German in public, on trains, over the telephone, and in religious services. One county sheriff in Iowa arrested a woman for speaking German to a neighbor over a fence in her own backyard. The justification was national security, but the enforcement was not limited to German. By 1918, 23 states had passed laws restricting or banning all foreign language instruction. In 1919, the year after the war ended, U.S. Steele published an internal memo congratulating its plant managers on the success of the English-only initiative. The memo noted that grievance filings had dropped by 34%, turnover had decreased, and productivity had increased. The memo did not mention language. It mentioned efficiency. But the math was simple. If workers cannot communicate with each other across language groups, they cannot organize. If they cannot organize, they cannot strike. The last documented case I found was in 1920. A family in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the Kovach family, descendants of Jan Kovach, who had been fired from Bethlehem Iron in 1895, were evicted from company housing. The reason listed on the eviction notice was violation of housing conduct standards. The specific violation, recorded in the company files, was that the grandmother, age 72, spoke only Slovak and had been overheard speaking to her grandchildren in that language on the back steps of the family home. The grandchildren, ages 8 and 11, were second-generation Americans born in Johnstown. The eviction notice stated that the use of foreign languages in the presence of minors was detrimental to their moral and civic development. The family was given 10 days to vacate. According to the Johnstown Tribune, the grandmother died 4 months later in silence. That eviction was not unusual. It was the system working as designed. By 1920, the transformation was nearly complete across the industrial heartland. The children of immigrants spoke English. Their parents spoke broken English. Their grandparents were silenced. And the languages that had built the railroads, mined the coal, and forged the steel were reclassified as Old World relics, unsuitable for modern America. The economic logic was never stated explicitly, but it was everywhere in the structure. You cannot organize what you cannot communicate. You cannot resist what you cannot articulate. And you cannot pass on what you are not allowed to speak. The official story ends here, a triumphant narrative of assimilation, of immigrants becoming Americans, of a melting pot forging a unified national identity. And for many families, that story is true. But I cannot stop looking at the ones it leaves out. The workers who were recruited because they were cheap, fired because they were foreign, and replaced because they were expendable. The children who grew up unable to speak to their grandparents. The languages that were not lost through natural generational shift, but were systematically dismantled through economic coercion. The questions nobody asks are the ones that stay with me. Why did the same companies that printed recruitment materials in 14 languages make it a fireable offence to speak those languages at work? Why did states pass English-only education laws in the exact same years that industrial labour demand required mass immigration? Why were the deadliest incidents of labour violence concentrated in communities where language barriers prevented workers from understanding commands, negotiating wages, or filing grievances? And what kind of economic system builds its expansion on the deliberate erasure of the people who make that expansion possible? I found one more thing while researching this. In 1976, a linguist at the University of Pittsburgh conducted oral history interviews with the descendants of Pennsylvania steelworkers. One woman, Mary Kovach, aged 68, described her childhood in the 1920s. Her grandmother had lived with the family and spoke only Slovak. Mary's father forbade the children from learning Slovak, fearing it would hurt their job prospects. The grandmother died when Mary was 12. Mary said she remembered sitting with her grandmother in the kitchen, watching her speak, unable to understand a word. She said, "I knew she was telling me something important. I could see it in her face, but the words were just sounds. And when she died, whatever she was trying to say died with her." The linguist asked what Mary thought her grandmother had been trying to tell her. Mary said, "I think she was telling me who we were, and I think we were supposed to forget. The buildings where those workers laboured are gone. The company towns have been dismantled. The records are incomplete. But the questions persist, and they connect to something larger than one family or one language. What happened to the words nobody was allowed to count? What system decided which languages lived and which disappeared? And what are we still not being told about the decades when language was currency, classified as American or foreign, spoken in secret or erased entirely, depending on which building you worked in, which town you lived in, and whether your labour was still worth more than your voice?"